And so what we now call the gay paper took shape in those 6 months in the last half of 1979. It was in September, or for the September issue, that we had a meeting and decided on a name for it, and it became the Gay Paper, which obviously was a ripoff of the City Paper. But curiously, it was the only gay paper in the country, and for years we had the claim on being the gay paper, which was kind of fun. It was put together in Gail's basement, as I said. I got more involved in a number of things, writing articles, doing some editing, that kind of thing. And by the end of the year, Arthur Stutzman, who had been the first chair of the newspaper committee, decided he was burned out on that project and moved along, and that's when I became the chair of the committee. In those days, everybody in the gay community that was politically active had a very egalitarian, actually Marxist is what it is, notion that things should be run by collectives rather than by individuals. Well, they did have a president to their organization because they needed it to have an incorporation and things like that. But the major work of the center was done by committees, the switchboard committee and the health committee and the newspaper committee, which published the gay paper. And so my role was that of chair of the newspaper committee. They didn't want anybody to be editor because that sounded like somebody was dictating the policy of the paper. And this was a collective thing, and we as a committee made all the decisions. It seems rather quaint in retrospect, and it was often very inefficient because you didn't have someone who you could go to and get an immediate decision. If something important had to be decided, you had to call a committee meeting and decide it by committee. Even if only 3 people showed up, it was a committee meeting. I was the chair of the paper for, I think, 1 year, maybe 2 years. That would be 80 and 81. Somewhere along the line, I asked Neil Dorschel to be a co-chair, take over some of the responsibility, and after that, shortly, we asked Mary Carroll, who had been a volunteer for a long time and who also agreed to be a co-chair. So by the time we were over in 83, or I was over, there were actually 3 co-chairs. Since co-chairs of committees had seats on the board of directors of the center, that was also a political move to increase our power because we now had 3 votes instead of just 1. It was a very political organization in those days.
I had been at University of Maryland for a year, very active in the Gay Student Alliance. And it was called the Gay Student Alliance, and the men and the women, and we were all there. And moved back to Baltimore to finish up my degree, because I spent 1 year at University of Maryland. And while I was at University of Maryland, I met Louise through Lisa. Then Lisa went and became a lawyer and a doctor somewhere. Me and Lou wound up moving to Baltimore together and living together. And it was at that time, and she had done a lot of work with Deacon McCubbin and Off Our Backs, Carol Douglas, who had started the first women's papers in Washington, D.C., and she was in with that whole group, and she just came to Baltimore with me, so she was really the activist. I was an artist. I'm not as politically charged as the rest of them, but had a lot of energy to bring to the group. So Lisa was out of the picture, and it was me and Lou. And Lou and I stayed together, and we were the couple. And So we went to Mitchell's and we met Gail Vivino. And she was doing all kinds of astrology stuff, but she was also, we had talked, involved with the gay things going on. And I was interested in that. And 14 phone calls later, that's how long it took for me to connect with them. And it was the night, I guess they needed help, or I don't know exactly what, but it was that night that they said, come on, we're going to start a paper. Because they had a little newsletter from the Gay Community Center, and we're going to start a little newspaper. And we did it at Harvey's basement. So I walked up the street, and Lou came a little later because she was at the house, because we were living together on right down the street from Harvey, it just so happens. We walked up, went into Harvey's, we were on the floor working, and by 2 o'clock, and Gail Vivino was there, and Arthur was there. May he rest in peace. He died of AIDS before starting Hero in Baltimore, the AIDS group. And so it was me and Harvey, and Harvey was our leader. He had the vision, and we all worked with him because he led the gay movement in Baltimore. The rest of them were around. But we didn't do it with any ulterior motive. We didn't know. It wasn't like we thought we're having the gay movement and we're going to be doing this. And Harvey wanted to do the paper, and so we did. Whereas I'll talk to A. Billy, who's in D.C. In D.C. it's a more political agenda. They knew that they were working on the gay movement, and in '79 they were planning a march on Washington. And of course we all went, and I have photographs of it. You know, I'm a photographer, so I photographed it all and gave a lot of those pictures to the Blade in D.C. Like going up, I was able to go up into the Washington Monument and take the elevator up. And look at thousands of people take pictures of all that. So I'm hoping they still have those photos. But getting back to that night in 1979, Gail left by around 10 or 11 at night. Lou fell asleep by 3. Me, Harvey, and Arthur were up for the rest of the night. I was drawing cartoons. One cartoon I gave to Gail Vino when I left the area, when I became a teacher and I left Baltimore about 2 years later. Me and Harvey and Arthur, we dropped off the first copy of the paper, and then we went to the Buttery for breakfast, which is like right around the corner from Walter's Art Gallery.
Functionally, I was the editor. Essentially, I was the one who decided about what copy went in and what copy didn't, and assigned tasks to people, and volunteers would show up, and I'd point them to do this or to do that, because somebody had to do that. It worked out, I think, very well, because we all got along very well within the paper. But functionally, I was the managing editor.
I did some articles too. I wrote on lesbians in the jail, because I had worked at the Baltimore City Jail for a while, so I did, some articles on that, and we did layout. I wasn't good at layout. The cartoons I did, the drawings. Once we got it started, we were the founders, and we organized it and got it rolling. Then other people started to come around. And Mary Lee, who helped me throw the parties for women, we had each year. We would get together like 300 women and throw parties, and we charged $1 a piece, and it covered the booze, it covered the food, and we broke even, and it got the word out to the women's community that there was a viable gay community center. And so I'd say I only worked on it maybe half a year.
Well, I started off as a writer, and very, very quickly, as people dropped out for various reasons, I wound up through attrition to become the chief, the head chairman on the newspaper committee. I left in 1984 as the editor at the time. I did continue to write for the paper on and off up until the early 2000s. And I guess it started in 1980, so basically I started writing in 80, was the editor from 83 to 84, and continued to be so until Baltimore Out Loud was born.
In those days, at the very beginning then, my involvement really was just as my broader involvement with the center, and occasionally, articles would be put in the paper, and I started putting a column in there called Beyond the Beltway, which was essentially news notes from around the country. I had a falling out with the guy who became the editor of the paper, so I stopped contributing for a little while, and then I got back involved when a guy named Jeff McCrae, he was a major force for a while in the paper. So I didn't have a position. I was contributing some, but I was on the board of the center, and so I had some involvement there. And then I guess when Mike Chase became editor, I joined the newspaper committee and was just a member of the committee, and I did this Beyond the Beltway column. And for a while I became the chair of the newspaper committee. Essentially the newspaper committee was the liaison to the board with the paper. And there was some friction off and on because the paper wanted to be an independent voice of the community, and that meant sometimes criticizing the center, and we had to negotiate those issues. And at one point, I remember people were really perturbed because center had run the paper had run an article that was critical of some of the board, and people were saying, we're all volunteers here. We don't really need to be trashed by our own, publication. So it was a tension, but people worked it out. That was the role I played. Then Mike was a great editor, and but he did clash with the center leadership, and ultimately sort of got pushed out. And the people who took over the paper ran it into the ground financially, and Mike was he was a unique person because he was both a good editor and a good business person, and so he knew how to balance the book. So I persuaded him to come back and take over again, and he managed to get the paper back on track. But he the center didn't treat him quite right a second time, and they didn't tell him whether they were going to renew his contract after the 3 years and all that stuff. So I said to him, if they don't renew it, you want to start a paper? And he said, well, maybe my boyfriend would be willing to do that. And that's how it ended up, that three of us, Mike's partner, Jim Williams, and I started Out Loud. And my motivation was to support Mike because I had felt like I had convinced him to come back to the center, and he essentially got screwed again. That's how I saw it. I also knew that he would do a great newspaper and he would do a great service to the community. So that was why I got involved. Mike's lover of 29 years died suddenly, and so Mike basically wanted out, and after a couple of years he moved out of state, and so Jim and I have sort of taken over, but we don't have the knowledge that he has. So we've been fortunate to have Steve as the editor for a while, and then Dana Roca was the editor, but there's sort of drama going on right now, and right now we have no editor, and so we're just going to sort of limp along while we try to figure out what's the next step is. But that was my main reason. So my role right now is I'm officially executive editor, but I haven't really been that involved in the editorial side. I still do my column. I try to find certain content because I have a certain interest, and I do the billing. Jim does the banking. We try to find good people to do the newspaper side of it.